Oh, I got that. Well, I've got that. Yes.
He was a modest fellow, honest, outspoken, plain of speech, and yet carrying an unconscious assumption of knowledge in his manner. So, printers were publishers and produced newspapers, but then the press drifted away from the core activities of stationers' company members. Throughout the 19th century, there were changes that transformed newspaper journalism and publishing and turned it into a giant industry with immense power. Michael Harris, in this book edited by Robin Myers, says that the press began to look like a juggernaut which was running away from the traditional booksellers. So what were some of those changes, and how did the stationers, some of the stationers, jump aboard the speeding juggernaut while others were left behind? Taxation was one of the barriers to publishing a newspaper. The so-called taxes on knowledge, including stamp duty, as represented here, raised money, but from the politicians' point of view, they also made life hard for anti-government newspapers. When the taxes were abolished by the mid-19th century, there was a huge increase in the number of newspapers. Among those people who campaigned for the end of repressive taxation was stationer Henry Hetherington, who stood in this here in this hall. That's where Elaine is sitting now, in this hall beside us, on November the 5th, 1805, and was made an apprentice to our famous stationer Luke Hansard. Henry was the son of a tailor. He was aged just 13, and he was to become an important campaigner against those repressive taxes. He founded the Poor Man's Guardian, which defiantly refused to pay the stamp duty and declared it was published in defiance of law to try the power of might against right. Another factor, technology also helped increase production. At the start of the 19th century, newspaper printing presses looked a bit like the one in the Caxton window there. Stationer John Walter II, who controlled the Times for 44 years, changed all of that. On November the 28th, 1814, he printed the Times on a steam-powered press, and that hugely increased the speed of production. Christopher McCain's brilliant book about John Walter II points out that the new presses rolled for the first time just 5 months after George Stephenson's prototype locomotive made its first successful run. And of course, the railways were another factor that transformed newspaper distribution. Railways meant newspapers could race across the country. And the railway lines also helped transmit information because the new telegraph wires were laid alongside the tracks from the 1840s. Today, we take instant information for granted. John Walter's Times famously reported the death of Nelson. Let's see how the news reached London. Nelson died on October the 21st, 1805, and the news crawled home. It went by sea. then by coach, and it took 16 days to arrive at the Admiralty on November the 6th. The Times broke the news that day, and it was still news. Life was certainly less well informed before the telegraphs. For example, racing results from the south of England took so long to reach Manchester that bookmakers would continue to take bets for up to 2 days after a horse race. The telegraphs changed all that, and two stationers, Sidney, you passed him on the stairs coming up here, and Alfred Waterlow played an important role in the telegraph revolution. The way it worked, the new telegraph wires followed the railway lines until they reached the main London stations. Then the rules said that they had to be buried underground, which was massively expensive. The Waterlows wanted to install a telegraph between the two of their offices, about a quarter of a mile apart. Sidney Waterlow, who was to be master of the stationers, and in fact, that's his banner over there, had the bright idea that instead of going under London, telegraph wires could go over it, strung over the buildings on the route. But of course, they ran into difficulty getting permission. Alfred wrote to Sidney, "Dear Sid, it seems we have to obtain the consent of the Commissioners of Sewers and of the owners and occupiers of all the houses on the line. I fear this could not be done." Sidney replies, "Dear Alf, I should feel inclined to do it and run the risk about the Commissioners of Sewers." So they did. And, you know, I do feel that if Sid and Alf were in charge, HS2 would have been built in about 18 months. There was another challenge. The Drapers' Company said that they had a freehold on their hall from the center of the earth to the canopy of heaven. Once again, the stop-at-nothing Waterlows satisfied the Drapers, and possibly the Almighty, by agreeing to pay £0.50 a year for permission to sling the wire over their roof. Personally, I do feel indebted to the Waterlows because the success of the telegraphs led directly to the creation of the Press Association. So Sid and Alf helped me pay my mortgage. Finally, the style of journalism changed so that bookish publishers must have felt like fish out of water among the new breed of journalists. Hugely successful popular newspapers were achieving massive circulations. Alfred Harmsworth, the driving force behind the Daily Mail, knew exactly what the ordinary reader wanted. His watchwords were explain, simplify, clarify. He declared, news is anything out of the ordinary, the only thing that will sell a newspaper. The new audience was the white-collar commuting middle classes, many of whom had never bought a paper before. Headlines grabbed the attention. Who wouldn't want to read "Head Torn Off" or "Killed by Rum"? And the no doubt inaccurate but uncheckable last words of a murderer heading for the scaffold, "Will it hurt?" And those brilliant scare stories that still unsettle and send an anxious thrill through readers, such as, "Is your porridge poison?" I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what am I going to have for breakfast tomorrow? Now, the newspaper owners had power, but they also wanted recognition. Some of the new journalists did join the stationers. Alfred Harmsworth's brother Cecil was admitted to the company before the First World War. But these giants who made the powerful tremble wanted more. When the Harmsworths sponsored an Arctic expedition, the explorers named landmarks after them. So the icy wastes of Franz Josef Land now had Cape Mary Harmsworth, the Harold Harmsworth Straits, and even our very own Cape Cecil Harmsworth. Now, I know we've had a lot of distinguished stationers, many of whom are here tonight, but Cecil may be the only one who's actually ended up on a map. So the newspaper industry wielded great power, but something was missing. Aretha Franklin summed it up in her song, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, Respect. In the movie, Citizen Kane built himself a castle, Xanadu, to show he was really someone. In the same way, the London newspaper bosses decided to set up the rather archaic Newspaper Makers Company in 1931. It was just like the stationers and other companies, but it was arriving on the scene about 500 years too late. It felt a bit contrived, not slightly bogus. It could certainly summon big names. Here in our archive is the picture of the Prince of Wales at its first dinner, where the entertainment was provided by the brilliantly named Arthur Crudge's British Imperial Orchestra. The stationers, meanwhile, liked the idea of merging with the wealthy newspaper makers. So just 2 years after it was formed, there was the Great Amalgamation and the new name. The negotiations were led by our master, Sir Percy Greenaway, who was described as a Pickwickian character with impeccable manners. Representing the newspaper makers was Ralph Blumenfeld of the Daily Express, known as the Dean of Fleet Street. The plan was that in the first year of the combined company, Greenaway would step aside after 6 months to allow Blumenfeld to be the master. But then the Prince of Wales agreed to be an honorary stationer and master, so Blumenfeld offered to do the heavy lifting for him. You know, Stationers' Hall, this room, must have been busy and crowded on October the 16th, 1933. The day that 87 newspaper makers were admitted to the company. And in a historic turn of events, women newspaper makers were admitted to the livery. The stationers had always been against it. One of them was Emily Peacock, the first woman reporter on the Daily Express, who'd fought long and hard to win a job as a journalist. Another woman who joined the livery was Betty Ross, an American journalist who had shown incredible determination to build her career. In her book, Reporter in Petticoats, she described her experience that day at Stationers' Hall in 1933. Betty looked at the court and wondered if she was in an Elizabethan painting that had come to life. Inevitably, she tripped over her gown, which was, of course, designed to be worn by a man. Betty, who had started out in Hartford, Connecticut, thought that admission to Stationers was the golden clasp to the chain of events which had begun when I earned my passport to Fleet Street. This was the climax of my career, to be admitted within the sacred precincts of the shrine built to the word. That night there was a banquet attended by the Prince of Wales, who also found his stationer's gown a bit on the big side. Betty said, "He reminded you of a small boy wearing his father's overcoat." When Betty wrote to her mother to inform her that she was now a member of Stationers' Livery, her mum in America assumed that she had fallen on hard times and was reduced to working with horses. Betty received a telegram that said, "Keep livery news secret and don't tell neighbours." The Stationers also admitted one of our own, women to the livery that day, Pippa Woodman. Sadly, it was made clear that this did not set a precedent. It was not until 1977 that the rules were amended to allow women to join the livery. And Cyprian Blagden was right. It was a homecoming, particularly for one member of the newspaper makers. We saw how Stephen Bryan stood here and was apprenticed as a stationer in 1699. And 234 years later, Harry Godfrey Davy, the editor of the Worcester paper that Bryan had founded, was back at Stationers' Hall to become a stationer and newspaper maker. And now his name sits in our archive along with that of Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you so much for that tour of newspaper history. We got the flavor in that of the entrepreneurial skills of those who created newspapers in all sorts of ways over the centuries. And Margaret, I think you're going to shed some light on other entrepreneurial aspects of their trade. Over to you, Margaret.
So thank you. So I'm going to be exploring a publishing phenomenon that helps give the context for the merger of the two companies. Can you hear this properly, or is it? Yeah. Okay. So we've heard that in the 18th century, the same printers produced books and newspapers, and then some of those were members of the Stationers' Company, and then the newspaper barons went their own way. But in the 1930s, a merger between the newspaper makers and the stationers seemed more plausible because publishers of books had started to produce newspapers, and newspaper publishers had started to produce fiction, so that they had more income streams than just advertising and circulation. This is the kind of fiction they produced. It doesn't look too hot, does it? So here's Edward Lloyd, who started out producing cheap serialized fiction.
It
I
jumped think. Yeah. You can go back.
Okay. He started out publishing cheap serialized fiction like Varney the Vampire and Sweeney Todd. And in Lloyd's case, these publications helped to fund his weekly newspaper, which was a huge success. And there were lots of firms around Fleet Street producing this kind of fiction. As we've heard, newspapers were taxed until 1855. So this sensational fiction helped publishers to keep afloat and avoid the impact of the tax. Oh, hang on. It does flip. So the lower classes were used to chapbooks hawked about the streets and at markets and fairs, and often these were about the lives of criminals. But in the 19th century, there was a surge of cheap periodicals, and this was spurred on by a growing population, rising literacy, and as we've heard, falls in the price of paper, which was machine-made from the 1820s, faster and cheaper printing technology, and the railways, which improved circulation. Now, the first recorded series for mass consumption was Lives of the Most Notorious Highwaymen, Footpads and Murderers, which was published in 60 weekly numbers. Later works were normally 8 pages, and the first half of page 1 was always a big illustration, and underneath that you get 2 columns of print, and when the 8 pages were full, the sentence stopped, sometimes mid-sentence, to be restarted a week later. Although you could buy 4 issues a month bound in a paper cover if you wanted to wait a month. These sensational tales were meant for adults, and they featured so much gruesome violence they were soon called penny bloods. So critics complained that their coagulated pages were filled with revolting scenes of murder, theft and depravity. Highwaymen was a favourite subject, but later bloods focused on horrible crimes and detection, and supernatural horror was another staple. Some blamed this melodramatic fiction on the tightening of copyright laws from 1842, which made it impossible to rip off works by authors like Scott and Dickens. And here's one obvious rip-off. The penny bloods were priced at working-class readers, so a penny an issue, and they were much cheaper than works by Dickens and Scott, which cost a shilling, so they're much, much cheaper. The Bloods soon attracted a younger readership. Juvenile literature had been mostly religious and improving, and by the mid-19th century, there still wasn't much that children could read for entertainment. But now publishers saw their chance, and they flooded the market with weekly story papers about highwaymen, pirates, explorers, and naughty schoolboys. Now, these penny numbers were soon called penny dreadfuls, and the trade term remained penny bloods, so the two terms are interchangeable. The stories were read eagerly by factory boys, errand boys, shop assistants, apprentices, as an escape, really, from crushing poverty and drudgery. And utterly poor boys formed clubs to share the price of a penny dreadful, and then they passed it around. Literacy was rising thanks to the Education Acts from 1870, well, 1831 in Ireland, but those unable to read had the stories read to them. And not all readers of the penny dreadfuls were lower class. I mean, middle and upper class boys enjoyed them too, but they didn't admit it. Mm-hmm. Now, the heroes of the penny dreadfuls are strikingly handsome, athletic, and charismatic. Now, earlier highwaymen, like Claude Duval, had appealed to women, but the heroes of these romances are just captivating for their looks and courage. And the author of Gentleman Clifford and his white mare Brilliant claimed that the women of London used to cross Hounslow Heath at midnight just for the sheer pleasure of being robbed by the so splendid man. Now, surprisingly, of course, the penny dreadfuls also display a fine moral sense. Their heroes never take advantage of their fainting heroines. I mean, you can see here, they protect the heroines. And many tales feature impossible incidents. In Black Bess, or The Knight of the Road, Dick Turpin manages to conceal the dead body of his horse, Black Bess, single-handedly, dragging her across the highway, through a gate, and under a wall. In Black Hawk, highwayman Hawk even bandages the wound of his fainting mistress while riding with her on horseback to safety. But you know, the readers never notice these ridiculous aspects of the stories. And publishers did assume that girls read these stories. So there was a serial called The Work Girls of London, Their Trials and Temptations. And some Blood and Thunder tales did invite female readers to imagine that they were daring heroines, not just victims. So there was one called Jenny Diver, the female highwayman. She was named after a skillful pickpocket from the 18th century Newgate calendar. But the description of Diver disguising herself, you know, to go on the road, takes its cue from the fact that in Victorian times, women weren't supposed to make up, but they could experiment with stage paint, you know, for actors. So the author describes Jenny Diver penciling her eyebrows, you know, with stage paint so that she looked fiercer and more masculine. The illustrations were crucial to the success of the penny dreadfuls. The weekly numbers were displayed in newsagents' shop windows, and dramatic covers featuring highwaymen leaping over toll gates or over bridges, or dramatic sword fights were meant to pique readers' curiosity and make sure that they were bought. And large prints were given away with some numbers, and successful publications might be reissued with prints bound in with them, either coloured or uncoloured, which readers coloured in themselves. So blood and murder literature was a competitive market. A freebie print was just one selling device. When Turpin and Bess, The Romance of the Road, was reissued in 1873, a free portrait of Turpin came with tinsel and foil trimmings so that readers could decorate the cuffs of his jacket and the skirts of his coat. So they were copying the theatre posters, you know, penny plain, tuppence coloured, which were decorated and tinselled at home. Now, social reformers were keenly interested in the reading matter of the boys of London. When journalist Henry Mayhew interviewed thousands on the margins of society, one London sneak or common thief told him that on Sunday evenings, the only books he and his pals read were Jack Sheppard, Dick Turpin, and the Newgate Calendar, which they borrowed from nearby libraries. And an 18-year-old vagrant told Mayhew that as a boy he had identified with Jack Sheppard. He said, "We used to think Jack and them very fine fellows. I wish I could be like Jack. I did then." Now, people feared that this violent material would lure working-class youngsters into a life of crime and encourage antisocial behavior. It all sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Journalist Samuel Phillips Day was one of the first to link penny fiction to crime in 1858. And he thought tales of robbers and highwaymen were likely to seduce the poorly educated to commit villainies. And he found that almost all young offenders and some adults regarded Turpin as a Robin Hood figure, kind to the poor and therefore unfairly punished. By the early 1870s, some critics took it for granted that this kind of fiction encouraged crime. At the very least, it was thought to be psychologically harmful. I mean, the term penny dreadfuls expresses disapproval in itself. The anxiety was obviously class-based. Critics worried about the effect of trashy literature on lower-class boys, not middle-class boys whom they thought smart enough to see through it. And the widespread notion that crimes were committed by a distinct criminal class hoarded into the slums of London made concerns seem urgent. Now, controversy about the penny dreadfuls intensified from the 1870s with the Education Acts. And some thought that this fiction would make the lower orders discontented and give them ideas above their station, and it might even encourage them to think for themselves. A series of well-publicized incidents stoked indignation against writers and publishers who seemed to be making money from corrupting the young. In 1872, Queen Victoria was attacked in her carriage outside Buckingham Palace. A young lad, Arthur Connor, pointed an old horse pistol at the Queen and passed a paper towards her. He was soon overpowered. The police found that the gun wasn't loaded and was too old to work anyway. But Connor, of Irish parentage, had wanted to present a petition to Her Majesty. When his home was searched, they couldn't find any motive for it, but they found piles of trashy literature. So they assumed that this penny dreadfuls had given him a desire for celebrity. Now, the government had set up a select committee to report on delinquent youth in 1862. And it seems really odd, but because of the concern about penny dreadfuls, a standard question was, do you know anything about highwaymen? And some artful dodgers readily blamed their way of life on the evil influence of the novels and plays about highwaymen that they'd seen in the newsagents, although other readers denied that any such material had affected them. Now, in time, the debate did improve literature for the lower classes. Penny dreadfuls themselves helped to foster a reading habit amongst the poor, and the vocabulary in them was actually quite difficult, so it improved literacy. They also helped to advance free public libraries because the establishment saw the advantages of making approved literature freely available to the poor. Although, ironically, some of the most borrowed books were actually penny dreadfuls found in one volume. By 1880, there were also penny abridgments of popular novels, including by Dickens and Scott. And a decade later, publisher George Newnes, who founded Tit-Bits in 1881, began a series of unabridged classic works of literature. And these were issued weekly and cost a penny a number. And he expressly did it so that he would undercut the penny dreadfuls, which were still popular. Of course, some complained that daily newspapers were just as lurid and damaging. But Blood and Thunder publications mostly died out by 1900, and this was owing to the efforts of Arthur Harmsworth, former contributor to Tit-Bits, who founded his own periodical publishing company and in 1896 set up the Daily Mail. He flooded the market with healthy halfpenny periodicals. So at a swoop, he undercut the market for this penny literature. And his amalgamated press also bought up most of the smaller firms around Fleet Street that was producing this sensational literature. And it was Harmsworth, as we've heard, who brought Ralph Blumenfeld back to journalism. the man who was key to founding the Newspaper Makers Company. American-born, he started out as a reporter, and by 1900 he was selling linotype machines when Harmsworth offered him a job on the Daily Mail. And as we've heard, he was master of the Newspaper Makers Company from 1931 to 1933, when members voted to surrender their charter. But I think the final word goes to Penny Dreadfuls. They were controversial, but they transformed print culture, embedding fanged vampires, supernatural monsters, and dashing highwaymen into our common psyche. Thank you.
We've heard of the steam press. We've heard of blood and murder. We need to go out into the streets. And Ross, I think you're going to be our guide as we head out onto Fleet Street.
We are. Can everyone hear me? Excellent. So, slightly different take, because I'm going to talk about things that may be lost and forgotten down Fleet Street. Bit of Ludgate Hill just thrown in for good measure, because I'm going to be using this particular map from 1851 to illustrate the areas that we are visiting. And once we leave, there's Stationers' Hall. And we leave there and we talk about possibly the first newspaper I was able to find a record of, which was the Oxford Gazette, which was first published in the 7th of November 1665, but was originally printed twice a week. Now, there were newspapers or news publications before this, but these were produced in pamphlet form in a similar manner to books at the time. So, was it really a newspaper? But I have found an early newspaper reference called the Post Boy, but when that exactly came out, I haven't been able to find any dates for yet. So what we've got is Elizabeth Mallet. Now, this is not an original picture. You might be surprised to learn. We don't actually have any period images of Elizabeth, but she founded in 1782 the Daily Courant, which, sorry, should have gone one, which was quite odd, being a woman to actually found a company at the time. She had made a bit of money with her husband David because they specialized in printing the last words of criminals about to be executed. So they'd be hoiked out of Ludgate or the Fleet Prison, let's go with that one because we're talking about Fleet Street, taken off to Tyburn where they were duly hanged. Now, these were very popular, these pamphlets in the 16 and 1700s. And some of them were available to buy before the person had actually been hanged. So whether they are accurate or not is up for debate. But they did make quite a lot of money. And they were based out of the now lost Black Horse Lane on Fleet Street. Now, there's a front cover of the first copy of the Daily Courant, which comes from the 11th of March, 1702. And it was a single sheet of paper. And it was only intended to publish foreign news. And the layout was organized to show where the information had come from and on which date. And this was to show that only the facts were being presented and not opinion. So it could be argued that Elizabeth could be the first newspaper editor, even though the role had yet to be invented. So it was originally published on Ludgate Hill, and if you go to Ludgate Hill and look up near where we have the crossroads with Fleet Street and Farringdon, you will see this plaque. It's really difficult to get a picture of it without the wire being in the way, I'm afraid. That's modern technology for you. But there we go. So that's where we are here. So we're making our way from east to west. And the paper itself only lasted in Elizabeth's hands for 40 days until she sold it, and it was ceased publication in 1735 when it merged with another newspaper, the Daily Gazetta. Now, nothing to do with newspapers here, but I couldn't not have this in here as well. A lost railway bridge that once crossed Ludgate Hill. So this illustration was produced in 1863 and it was published in the Illustrated London News. And actually, if you were to try and stand in a similar position to that today, only 2 buildings survive. St Paul's and St Martin's within Ludgate. Also what we lost was this railway station. This is Ludgate Hill Station, and I've put in a little arrow on the side to show where the bridge was. So it gives you an idea of where this was actually located. And it was closed in 1929, this station, but it would stay there until the 1960s, until it was eventually demolished. The bridge itself was not taken down until 1990. So as you can see from this map here, you can see why possibly the station didn't do very well, because at the bottom you have St Paul's Station as was. It's now known as Blackfriars. And the one above it is the current City Thameslink, which was Holborn Viaduct. So there's far too much competition for it to have survived. How the railway is still running there without the bridge is a story for another talk, I'm afraid. That is a real, that is a massive talk in itself. Now, here we have the corner of Fleet Street in Farringdon. Now, the city currently has 114 livery companies, with the human resource professionals being the most recent. Some have ceased to exist down the years, including the comb makers, the soap makers, and the hat band makers. But others, like the newspaper makers, have joined with others to amalgamate, as we have heard from our previous speakers. Now, Jonathan covered a bit of the newspaper makers in his talk, but he was kind enough to allow me to talk about this. Now, it is on the front cover of your little brochure. This fantastic looking building was meant to be their hall. Now, the proposed location, we weren't able to find out where it was, but we took a bit of a guess and thought that it would be on the corner of Fleet Street and Farringdon, because that would be the best place to have it. Now, there is a small memorial to the newspaper makers on that corner, and it's to Edgar Wallace. Now, he was a founder member of the Newspaper Makers Guild, and he's possibly, and has been described as, the most famous writer that no one has ever heard of. Now, he began selling newspapers on Ludgate Circus, and so this plaque is well located. He was a war correspondent, and then he turned his hand to writing fiction. He was very prolific, with 957 short stories and 170 novels. He sold about 50 million copies of his books worldwide, and he made an absolute fortune and then decided to gamble it all away. He was also a scriptwriter, and he produced the first sound version of The Hound of the Baskervilles, and he wrote the first draft of the film that was to be King Kong. He is listed at the bottom of both of these wonderful period posters. Unfortunately, he died before King Kong was actually made. So, just to let you know, if you go onto the corner there, that is where you will find the plaque. So there is our current map. So as you can see, we're working our way down. Also, I couldn't not talk about the River Fleet, one of our 2 lost rivers in the City of London. For most of its history, nothing more than an open sewer lined with slum housing and prisons. Now, I can't guarantee that this is actually what it looks like today. When Google is wonderful, but unless you actually get down into the river itself. So assume that this is the River Fleet, and this is what it looks like today. So, one thing that we have definitely lost on Fleet Street is the press baron. Here is one of them, maybe one of the more famous ones, Matt Aitken, or Lord Beaverbrook. Now, not only did he own newspapers and other businesses in his native Canada, but when he came to the United Kingdom, he acquired the Daily Express. And from 1931, they were in this rather impressive and still in existence Art Deco building, which was described by Private Eye as the Black Lubyanka after the Moscow HQ of the Soviet secret police. Now, here is the actual Lubyanka in Moscow. I must point out I did not take this photograph myself. And I think it was more to do with the strong views of the owners and editors of the newspaper than anything to do with the structure of the building itself. Now, Beaverbrook was a behemoth on Fleet Street. Not only did he stride Fleet Street with his newspaper, but he was in the corridors of power. He was MP for Ashton-under-Lyne up near Manchester between 1910 and 1916. And he only gave it up when he became a lord in 1917. And as you can see from this slide, These are the roles he had in government during the Second World War, which might have helped that he was good friends with Winston Churchill. Now, I will be looking at another press baron shortly. So, there's our current list. Now, it hasn't come out quite as I expected, but this, as far as I can tell, is every single newspaper that's ever been on Fleet Street. That is quite a list, as you can tell. And if you can see, some of them are in red. They still exist, as far as I could tell. But some of the names are quite good fun, like the Anti-Jacobean, which was founded to oppose the radicalism of the French Revolution, as well as a reference to the Catholic King James II and his descendants. Now, this was a bit of a niche publication, only lasted for about a year. We also have the wonderfully named Black Dwarf, which supported reform and working class interest, and it was also revived in the late 60s as a political publication with a socialist bent. Also, we had the children's newspaper, which ran for an astonishing 46 years and focused on news stories of interest to the younger generation. For those of a certain generation, this was essentially John Craven's news round of its day. My personal favourite, though, is this, the Workers' Dreadnought. Unfortunately, that's the best picture I could get of it, taken inside a display cabinet at the London Archives. Highly recommend you go there, guys. There's a fantastic exhibition on at the moment about punishment. Now, this was founded in 1914 as a communist newspaper. You might be able to tell that from the hammer and sickle I've circled at the top. It really did nail its colours to the mast, this paper. And it was founded by former suffragette Sylvia Pankhurst. Now, I'm not sure why they picked the name Dreadnought, because essentially that was a class of ship built in 1906 that was so ahead of its time, they named a whole class of ship after it. As you can also see, it's got Karl Marx on the front, once again, for our communist connections. And this particular edition was published in 1920, and the article is supposedly written by a sailor in the Royal Navy, complaining about conditions being so bad that the whole Navy should go on strike. It did lead to the police raiding the offices of the newspaper, and Pankhurst was sent to prison for 6 months, being the editor under the crime of incitement to mutiny. So, we do have a list of some of our former newspapers in Fleet Street on the wonderful Heritage Sundial. You're going to have to excuse my pronunciation here, but it's the corner of Fleet Street and Bouvier Street. And this was where the top one on here, the Republican, was published by the journalist Richard Carlisle. Now, he fought for press freedoms for about 40 years, and until his death in 1843. And he was repeatedly prosecuted by the authorities for his efforts to publish and distribute works such as Tom Paine's The Rights of Man. He was also present at the Peterloo massacre in Manchester, where he was about to address the crowd before the local cavalry, which had been sent in by the local magistrates to arrest the main speaker, charged the audience. 18 people were killed and between 400 and 700 people injured. The establishment had seen this meeting as a threat to the status quo. Carlisle, though, was determined to report the facts as he saw them, and the Republican was the only London-based newspaper to report on this event. He would also spend 9 years in prison for libel, but was amazingly allowed to continue his editorial work whilst behind bars. But he is seen as an important campaigner and for the establishment of universal suffrage and the freedom of the press. Now, this chap here has come up in both of my fellow speakers' talks, but you can see why he was from just some of the statistics. This is a bust of Alfred Harmson on the side or the front of the wonderful church of St Dunstan's in the west. Now, Lord Beaverbrook, who we met earlier, said that of Harmsworth, he was the greatest figure ever to have strode down Fleet Street. Now, he really wanted to cover his bases because he not only owned the Daily Mail, but he also owned the Daily Mirror. So you're covering both sides of the political divide there. And he exerted a massive influence over the newspaper industry and popular opinion before World War I. By 1902, the circulation of the Daily Mail was 1 million a day, being the most, or supposedly the largest newspaper circulation in the world at that time. His portfolio also included the Observer, the Times, and the Sunday Times. And by 1914, 40% of all daily newspapers and 15% of Sunday newspaper circulation was owned by him. His editorship of the Daily Mail displayed a very anti-German sentiment, which led to the Star newspaper, which was not the same as the one we have today, to declare, next to the Kaiser, Alfred Harmsworth has done more than any living man to bring about this war. His influence was such that he was created Director of Propaganda in David Lloyd George's World War I government. And this might have been why, in 1917, a German warship went into the English Channel to shell his house in Kent. Supposedly, and I wasn't able to find a picture of this, it would have been wonderful to find one. Supposedly, the damage is still on the side of this house. Unfortunately, his gardener's wife was actually killed in the attack. It is said that when he died, he is said to have left 3 months' pay to each one of his 6,000 employees. Now, one of the other things that we have lost down Fleet Street are a lot of the jobs. So here is just a selection. I'm sure I've missed off lots, but we have the reporter, the investigative journalist, the columnist, the editor, the photojournalist, the editorial cartoonist, advertising sales, and typesetters. Now, in the building next to St Dunstan's in the west, this was the headquarters of Scottish publisher D.C. Thomson, they of the Beano and the Dandy. Some of their other publications are advertised on the side, with only the People's Journal not being in print. Now, we were at Ludgate Hill with the first newspaper. This is the last editorial establishment on Fleet Street. So actually, we've got a nice symmetry there. And the reason I like to bring it up is not only that, is because a friend of mine used to be a tour guide on the open-top buses that went up and down Fleet Street. And he said that when they stopped outside this offices at traffic lights or whatever, he would declare in the loudest voice he could, there are no more journalists on Fleet Street, which would lead the journalists on the first floor to open the window and go, but we are still here. Unfortunately, since 2016, we have not had any journalists on Fleet Street at all. One thing that we've also lost down Fleet Street are some businesses. Now, I only saw this last week when I was looking for something completely different, but I thought it was too good not to put in, considering they are stationers and printers. This wonderfully named Partridge and Cooper is the building's now occupied by a Harrison Hall Cafe. And I did ask our wonderful archivist Ruth to see if they were actually members of the company, and it doesn't seem that either of them were. But she did give me a nice little tidbit, which was to say that this company evolved into one that set up, were sellers of office furniture and supplies, and a young Timothy West worked for them before he decided to be an actor. If you look on the bottom right, you'll see something called the Cyclo Style. If you're wondering what one of those is, it's this. It's a very early small printer. Now, all good stories should end up in a bar, and we finish with El Vino's. Now, this was the watering hole to many a journalist back in the day. It was also the aforementioned headquarters of the Private Eye's famously alcoholic journalist, Lunchtime O'Booze, a spineless hack working on the street of shame, which is how the Eye described Fleet Street. The name was in reference to the infamously famous liquid lunches for which journalists were said to indulge. Lunchtime would also get his job done by spending hours drinking copious amounts of red wine, exchanging the latest juicy gossip, or plying sources with champagne, or truth juice, as it was meant to be known in the trade, to glean information. So I will leave it to those who may have frequented El Vino's back in the day to say how accurate those exploits are. It's not for me to say. But the journalists may have gone, but the bar still attracts the patrons from the surrounding courts and legal offices. And there we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ross. Time rushes on. But I will just ask whether there is any, what I'm afraid is a closing question or observation anyone would like to make to give that opportunity. And there's a microphone. Yes, in the middle here, please. Could you put your hand up again? Yes, thank you. Coming down the row.
Thank you. Sharon Maxwell Magnus, University of Hertfordshire. I just wanted to ask Dr. Lincoln about the Penny Dreadfuls. Were they ever real stories, or were they always made up, or were they based? Some of them were based on factual events.
Well, they were based on fact to the extent that there was a Dick Turpin. There wasn't a Gentleman Clifford. But, of course, it's completely romanticized and sensationalized. I mean, Turpin was a thug. He wasn't a dashing highwayman. And also the Penny Dreadfuls put highwaymen who weren't alive at the same time together in the same story. So you can't believe it. It's good fun, though. They're quite good. I've read loads. I recommend them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Margaret, I'm going to suggest to everyone that we continue the conversation. My eye's on the clock. It's 1 second past 8 o'clock. So I'm going to suggest that we continue the conversation with a glass in our hand as appropriate. I will shortly thank our speakers, but just a little couple of things I want to point to. First of all, the brochure that you had on your seats, you will see it's an actual brochure produced by the newspaper makers when they were planning this building with its 277-foot tower. We've inserted on the inside cover a note about tonight. But do have a look afterwards. Fascinating, the grand plans that they had for the newspaper makers. Secondly, Ruth has put in some tremendous work on the exhibition, which is in the courtroom. Many of you, I know, have been in there. Do nip in if you can, sadly without food or drink, into that room because of the precious nature of the documents. But there are newspapers from the general strike. There are the records of Elizabeth Mallet and her work on the Daily Courant. There are all sorts of other pieces, and Ruth will be available to guide you to those. But thirdly, through in the stockroom, there will be sandwiches, there will be drinks, and the opportunity to chat with our speakers. So, for the moment, please join me in thanking our speakers for such wonderful talks. And, as is only right and proper, I'll leave the final word to the Master.
Oliver, you've been brilliant pulling this together. And so thank you personally for that. And thank you for the kind words from Jonathan about the Evening Standard. Now, I think one thing nobody has talked about here is AI. And it's going to be interesting if in 100 years' time, how this period we're going through is demonstrated, because this is seismic, the change at the moment, social media, AI, and it's possibly a concentration of change that nobody's seen in 300 years. So it'll be good. But thank you today. And Alvino's, I was there recently. They now serve women.
Right, yes, yeah.
And it's certainly Harmsworth has been said the Minister for Propaganda. I think the Daily Mail have overtaken them. But it's certainly interesting to hear the names. Edgar Wallace. Edgar Wallace lives on because it's the prize that's given each year for the London Press Club, which is in this building. Yeah. So Edgar Wallace lives on. But thank you all, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin.
And then finally, if you'd like to join us in the stockroom for a drink, or in the courtroom for a look at the exhibitions, as said. Thank you.